What began as an attempted lynching at the jail erupted into a massacre. From a high grain elevator, a machine gun laid fire on Greenwood Avenue. The police joined the mob. National Guard troops pressed the attack against what one guard officer called the enemy. Quotes from eyewitnesses include, "Old women and men, children were running and screaming everywhere."
That 60 Minutes piece talking about the Tulsa Massacre, a horrific yet little-known chapter in American history. Nearly 100 years ago, white mobs descended upon a part of town that was so prosperous it was called Black Wall Street. Hundreds of buildings destroyed, 35 city blocks burned to the ground, and as many as 300 African Americans were murdered. Tulsa is also the site chosen by the Trump campaign to hold the president's rally tomorrow, his first one since the COVID outbreak shut down the country. It was originally scheduled for today, which is Juneteenth, a day that celebrates the end of slavery. After a huge amount of backlash about the date and obviously the location, the rally, it was moved to tomorrow, but local health officials wish that it wasn't happening at all, and they are concerned that a packed indoor arena could spur a COVID outbreak. The campaign is also apparently worried about the virus, as it is making people there sign waivers not to hold the campaign liable if anyone contracts the virus. All right, let's bring in our guest to now discuss the historical significance of Tulsa and why he says it's so disagreeable the president is speaking there on this day. Nehemiah Frank, he's the founder and director of the Black Wall Street Times. It is amazing at how this hugely important chapter of American history was kept so secret for so long. 60 Minutes, as you know, did a recent profile on it. The amount of people who grew up in Tulsa, when they heard the stories, literally when they went to Oklahoma University, they said, "You got it wrong. I grew up, I never heard this story." As horrible as the atrocities that happened, which we'll get into in a second, I can't think of another story, can you, that in the last 100 years was buried in the archives of history that wasn't shared?
I think I'm probably sitting in the same boat as you and most of the people that live here in Tulsa. Actually, our city councilor, she just walked out the door. I'm sitting in the basement of the historic Vernon AME Church, which was the basement was actually survived the massacre. But yeah, I did not learn about this history until I was an adult. I was almost 30 years old when I found out about the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre.
This sounds asinine, but the series on HBO, The Watchmen, where they profile what happened, I just thought that was a product of Hollywood. But my gosh, there was more of a basis of truth in it. Give an idea just how prosperous and unique, and of all places, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street was, and comparatively, how it was such a beacon of hope for a community that had been mistreated for so long.
Well, it was definitely called the Promised Land for a reason, and that's because even in the shadow of Jim Crow, African Americans were able to come here, many of them coming from the rural South where racial hostility was widespread. And they came here to Tulsa, Oklahoma's Greenwood District, home of the Black Wall Street, and they were able to create their version of the American dream.
The historical accounts of this have varied widely until a commission was appointed. Originally, it was said, I think, that maybe 30 people had died. We now know that number at least 10 times that, and they're looking forensically at the graves, at the mass graves, to try and do a truer accounting of this. But the scope of the horror, and they call it, right now, the worst incidence of racial history in our country, and unfortunately that's saying something. Literally setting fire, shooting people in broad daylight, aerial attacks. This thing was clearly concerted, and it seemingly had the blessing of law enforcement.
Yeah, it definitely was orchestrated by some architect that had planned this. I don't know if you know the story of Dick Rowland and Sarah Page, but two teenagers in an elevator did not ignite the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. It may have been the match, that began the drama that took place. But it was racial hostility. It was jealousy because these people in this prosperous African American community were doing extremely well. They had law offices. They were doctors. They were pilots. People that went to Tuskegee University and represented this country in the government, the uh, the military, only to come back to deal with racial hostility and even be lynched during the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre.
To that end, as we fast forward to obviously in the aftermath of George Floyd, you have a couple of competing historical reckonings going on. Nationally, obviously, a re-examine of race and policing, but the president choosing of all places Tulsa and of all places originally Juneteenth as the day to do it. And yet, where I'm coming from here in the studios in New York, Andrew Cuomo recognized it as a state holiday going forward here. Talk about the importance of the day. And then also the importance of the significance of a president choosing that day in that city to have a rally. I assume you don't chalk it up to coincidence.
I don't chalk anything up with this president. Honestly, I think that he did it intentionally. The election is coming. He knows that he's behind, and what better way to ignite his base than to come to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where of course there was the race massacre, but and racial hostility. Like this is the place to stroke racial tensions. And we heard that the president may actually try to come to the Greenwood district and take a picture, kind of like how he did just outside of Lafayette Square, and people aren't happy about it, not at all. We're actually pretty worried that if the president does decide to come to Greenwood, even though he has been advised by our governor now and Senator James Langford to not come to Greenwood, but if he does, we do believe that there will be violence, unfortunately.
Given the newfound attention and overdue attention to what happened in 1921 and the historical significance, how do you, if it's used well, it's so hard to get the national attention to focus on anything, as you know, Nehemiah, for more than 15 minutes, given every day there's a new headline. But to take advantage of this window of focus, what do you hope they walk away with?
I would hope that people would walk away with understanding the historical significance of not just the massacre itself, but the fact that African American people are resilient. I know we're expecting a very diverse crowd here on Greenwood, and I think that kind of speaks to the fact that although there are a lot of nasty things that are taking place in this country as far as racial hatred, still dealing with racial hatred, right, since 1619. But I think it speaks to the fact that we're still growing and that there's a large number of Americans who are non-Black that, believe that Black lives matter. And, we want justice for our community. And even when it comes to, George Floyd's death, those justices, they stem from, the micro level all the way to the macro level. Justice is, Black America deserves justice, whether it's economic justice, educational justice, a restitution for its wrongs against African Americans.
Well, I sure hope this weekend that the right messages and the right recognition is done. It doesn't turn into something of a political photo op because, as you say, there are many people here who will not take that well. Hopefully it doesn't degenerate into that. But Nehemiah, thank you so much for the time. I appreciate it, and best of luck this weekend.
Thank you.
When we come back, just yesterday, the Supreme Court handed down a significant ruling for DACA recipients, dreamers. Well, after the break, we'll be joined by a dreamer herself, someone obviously impacted by the ruling of yesterday. She'll explain why it matters so much to so many people.